You hear the splash of water in the Bosphorus Strait, but this isn't the sound of waves against the shore. It's the sound of weighted sacks hitting the water. Inside each one, a woman who, moments earlier, was alive in the Sultan's harem. According to historical records and some sources from the 17th century, Sultan Ibrahim once ordered the execution of 280 women in a single day. Not because they committed crimes or posed political threats, but because he suspected one of them had been unfaithful, and he couldn't determine who, so he killed them all. Before we dive deeper, if you value rare and brutal truths like this, consider subscribing to Still Scholars and comment where you're watching from. It helps us tell more stories history tried to erase. Now back to the story. This isn't fiction. This isn't propaganda from enemy states. These are documented historical facts, preserved in Ottoman court records, European diplomatic reports, and eyewitness testimonies that reveal a system of absolute power that turned the imperial harem into a death trap for thousands of women across centuries. The Ottoman Sultans wielded power over life and death with casual brutality that would shock modern audiences. But what you're about to discover goes beyond individual acts of cruelty. We're talking about systematic practices that transformed marriage into imprisonment, intimacy into survival, and disobedience into a death sentence. The evidence comes from the Sultan's own court historians, from European ambassadors who witnessed these horrors firsthand, and from Ottoman administrative records that tracked executions with bureaucratic precision. Sultan Ibrahim earned his nickname, the Mad, through acts so depraved that even his contemporary chroniclers struggled to record them. The mass drowning of 280 harem women represents just the beginning of his reign of terror against the women in his palace. When Sivakar Sultan informed Ibrahim that one of his concubines had been compromised by an outsider, the Sultan's response wasn't investigation or justice, it was wholesale slaughter. The execution process was methodical and horrifying. Royal gardeners were summoned to the harem quarters, not to tend flowers, but to sew women into weighted sacks. Each woman was bound, placed inside a sack with heavy stones, and the opening sewn shut while they were still alive. Then came the march to the Bosphorus, where palace executioners threw them one by one into the water. The historical record preserves the terror of this moment through the testimony of the single survivor. One woman managed to tear through her sack underwater and surface near a French merchant vessel. Her rescue created a diplomatic incident that scandalized European courts and provided first-hand testimony of the massacre. She described watching hundreds of her companions disappear beneath the waves, their muffled screams silenced by the water. But Ibrahim's madness didn't stop with mass executions. Court records document his personal involvement in individual murders that reveal the psychological torture these women endured daily. When he suspected a concubine of looking at another man, he didn't simply have her killed. He forced her to watch as he executed her closest friend first, then made her choose the method of her own death. When she refused to choose, he had her strangled with silk cords while he watched, claiming it was an act of mercy. The systematic nature of these murders becomes clear when examining the broader practices across multiple reigns. Sultan Murad Bafov inherited 240 wives when he assumed the throne in 1623. Rather than exile them or allow them to remarry, he ordered every single one drowned to make room for fresh concubines. The court records describe this as routine housekeeping, like clearing out old furniture to make space for new acquisitions. Murad IV's personal involvement in violence extended beyond the harem walls. Palace chronicles record his daily quota of executions, noting that the Sultan considered it his prerogative to take at least 10 innocent lives per day. When he encountered a group of women singing in a park and decided he disliked their voices, he ordered them drowned on the spot. No trial, no investigation, no consideration of their families or circumstances. Their crime was existing in a way that displeased the Sultan. The execution methods themselves were designed to maximize psychological terror, while maintaining the appearance of royal dignity. Strangulation was the preferred method for harem women because it prevented the spilling of blood on expensive palace carpets. The executioners used silk handkerchiefs or cords, applying pressure slowly to prolong the victim's suffering. Court physicians were sometimes present, not to save lives but to ensure the executions were carried out with proper technique. Even Suleiman the Magnificent, celebrated as the greatest of Ottoman rulers, participated in this system of feminine extermination. The case of Gülfem Kardin reveals how trivial accusations could result in death sentences. When palace gossip suggested that Gülfem had sold her turn to spend the night with the Sultan to another woman, Suleiman's rage was immediate and deadly. He ordered her execution without investigation or trial. The execution of Gülfem followed the standard protocol for harem murders. She was summoned to appear before the chief black eunuch, who delivered the Sultan's sentence. Mute executioners then strangled her with silk cords, while palace officials recorded the event in their execution ledgers. The irony of this particular murder became apparent only after Gülfem's death, when Suleiman learned that the accusations were false. His grief was overwhelming, leading him to execute the mute executioners who had carried out his orders and to mourn for days. This pattern of execution, followed by regret, appears repeatedly in Ottoman court records, suggesting that many sultans killed impulsively and questioned their decisions only after the irreversible act was complete, but the system itself prevented any meaningful accountability. Dead women couldn't testify to their innocence, and the absolute power of the Sultan meant that questioning his judgment, even after proven wrong, was itself a capital offence. The legal framework supporting these executions was codified in Ottoman law through the Law of Fratricide, established by Mehmed II. While originally designed to prevent civil wars by allowing new sultans to murder their brothers, this legal precedent established the principle that the sultan's survival and comfort justified any level of violence against potential threats, real or imagined. This legal foundation was then extended to justify violence against women who might pose emotional or sexual threats to the sultan's absolute control. The bureaucracy of murder was as organized as any other aspect of Ottoman administration. The Haznadar, or chief treasurer, maintained detailed records of each sexual encounter between the sultan and his women, recording dates, participants, and outcomes. When executions occurred, these same officials documented the reasons, methods, and disposal of bodies with the same meticulous attention to detail they applied to tax collection or military campaigns. The fountain of execution in the first court of Topkapi Palace served as the designated washing station where executioners cleaned blood from their hands after decapitations. The casual placement of this fountain in a central courtyard, where palace staff and visitors would see it daily, reinforced the normalization of violence within the Ottoman power structure. Women entering the harem would pass this fountain, understanding immediately that death was not an abstract threat but a daily reality within the palace walls. The psychological impact on surviving harem women was calculated and devastating. Those who witnessed executions were forbidden from discussing what they had seen, creating an atmosphere of terror reinforced by enforced silence. Women developed elaborate codes and signals to communicate warnings about the Sultan's moods, creating an underground network of survival information that operated beneath the official harem hierarchy. The scale of this systematic violence becomes clear when examining the broader demographic impact. Historical records suggest that thousands of women died in Ottoman harems across the centuries, not from disease or natural causes, but from deliberate execution. Each death represented not just individual tragedy, but the destruction of families and communities whose daughters, sisters, and mothers disappeared into the imperial palace, never to return. The screaming stopped when the silk cord tightened around her throat, but for the other women watching from behind the latticed windows, the real horror was just beginning, because they knew that tomorrow it could be them. Subscribe to Still Scholars for more historical truths. The execution of pregnant concubines reveals perhaps the most calculated cruelty in Ottoman palace practices. When Zafira Hatun became pregnant, while Ibrahim was still a prince, violating the strict harem hierarchy that determined who could bear royal children, her fate was sealed not by law, but by political convenience. Ottoman Sultan, Ibrahim's mother, and the most powerful woman in the empire, personally ordered the drowning of both mother and unborn child. The execution was delayed only because the chief black eunuch initially refused to kill a pregnant woman. But Kosim's authority was absolute. She issued the order again, and this time there was no hesitation. Zafira was sewn into a weighted sack while still carrying the child, then thrown into the Bosphorus. The palace records note this execution with the same bureaucratic detachment used for recording grain purchases or tax collections. This wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a broader system of reproductive control that turned pregnancy into a death sentence for unauthorized women. The harem operated under strict hierarchies, where only certain women were permitted to bear the sultan's children. Any pregnancy outside these designated ranks was considered a form of treason, punishable by immediate execution. The methods of controlling female reproduction went beyond simple murder. Palace physicians were required to examine harem women regularly, not for their health, but to detect unauthorized pregnancies. Women suspected of being pregnant were isolated in special quarters where they could be monitored constantly. If pregnancy was confirmed and the woman lacked proper authorization, the execution order was automatic. Some women attempted to hide pregnancies through various means, but the palace surveillance system made this nearly impossible. Other concubines were rewarded for reporting suspected pregnancies, creating a network of informants that turned the harem into a prison where women spied on each other for survival. The psychological toll of this system cannot be overstated. Women lived in constant fear not just of the Sultan's displeasure, but of their fellow prisoners who might betray them for small privileges or simply to deflect suspicion from themselves. The case of Gülfem Kadın illustrates how false accusations could destroy lives within this paranoid environment. When palace gossip suggested she had sold her scheduled night with Süleyman to another woman, the accusation itself became evidence of guilt. The harem system made verification impossible because admitting to such arrangements would implicate multiple women in capital offences. Süleyman's reaction to the accusation reveals the hair-trigger violence that characterized Sultan behavior toward their women. He didn't order an investigation or demand evidence. He simply commanded Gülfem's immediate execution, shouting that no one could sell his love like a commodity. The mute executioners carried out the strangling while Süleyman watched, his rage temporarily satisfied by the sight of Gülfem's death. The aftermath of this execution demonstrates the arbitrary nature of Sultan justice. When Süleyman later learned that the accusations were fabricated, his grief was genuine, but ultimately meaningless. Gülfem remained dead, and the system that enabled her murder remained unchanged. Süleyman's decision to execute the mute executioners who had carried out his orders was not justice, but another expression of arbitrary power. The men had only followed direct commands, but the Sultan needed someone to blame for his own impulsive cruelty. This pattern of execution, followed by regret, appears throughout Ottoman palace records, suggesting that many sultans acted on momentary anger without considering consequences. But the absolute nature of their power meant that these momentary decisions had permanent, deadly results for the women involved. The sultans might experience regret, but they faced no accountability, no legal consequences, and no meaningful restrictions on their ability to kill again. The normalization of violence against harem women extended to the palace staff who carried out these executions. The mute executioners were deliberately selected for their inability to speak about what they witnessed. These men, often captured in childhood and surgically rendered mute, became the instruments of systematic murder while being unable to testify about their actions. The chief black eunuch held ultimate authority over harem executions, serving as both judge and executioner for women accused of various offences. His power was nearly absolute within the female quarters, and his decisions could mean life or death for hundreds of women. Historical records show that some chief eunuchs used this power to eliminate personal enemies or rivals, turning the execution system into a tool for settling private grievances. The physical methods of execution were designed to maintain the appearance of dignity while maximizing psychological terror. Drowning in the Bosphorus was preferred because it removed the bodies from the palace grounds and eliminated evidence of mass murder. The weighted sacks ensured that bodies would sink immediately, preventing the kind of diplomatic incidents that occurred when the French ship rescued Ibrahim's surviving victim. Strangulation remained the method for executions within the palace itself, carried out in designated chambers where the sounds couldn't reach other harem residents. The silk cords used for these killings were often blessed by palace religious authorities, adding a grotesque religious dimension to systematic murder. The executioners were trained to apply pressure gradually, prolonging the victim's suffering while maintaining the ritual nature of the killing. The disposal of bodies was handled with the same bureaucratic efficiency that characterized other palace operations. Records were kept of each execution, including the victim's name, the reason for execution, the method used, and the disposal of remains. These ledgers were maintained alongside records of food purchases, military expenditures, and diplomatic correspondence, treating murder as routine administrative business. The psychological preparation of victims before execution reveals another layer of calculated cruelty. Women sentenced to death were often held in isolation for days or weeks before their execution, allowing fear to build while preventing any possibility of rescue or reprieve. During this time, they were visited by palace religious officials who encouraged them to accept their fate as divine will, adding spiritual manipulation to physical terror. Some women were forced to participate in elaborate pre-execution rituals designed to demonstrate their acceptance of the Sultan's judgment. These ceremonies often included public confessions of guilt, whether real or fabricated, and expressions of gratitude for the Sultan's mercy in granting them a quick death rather than prolonged torture. The psychological manipulation involved in forcing victims to thank their executioner represents perhaps the most twisted aspect of this entire system. The impact on surviving harem women was carefully calculated to maximize compliance through terror. Public executions within the harem served as warnings to other women about the consequences of disobedience. Private executions created uncertainty and fear because women never knew when someone might simply disappear, fostering an atmosphere of constant anxiety that made resistance nearly impossible. The evidence reveals a system so thoroughly designed to break human spirits that survival itself became an act of rebellion. Women who endured years in the Ottoman harem developed psychological conditions that modern psychiatrists would recognize as severe trauma responses. They learned to move without sound, to breathe without detection, to exist without leaving traces that might displease their captors. The training process for new harem women involved systematic psychological conditioning that would make modern interrogation techniques look primitive. New arrivals were stripped of their names, their languages, their cultural identities. They were given Turkish names, forbidden from speaking their native tongues, and punished for displaying any attachment to their previous lives. The goal wasn't just compliance, but complete personality reconstruction. Palace records document the stages of this psychological destruction with clinical precision. First came isolation, where new women were kept alone for weeks while palace officials studied their personalities and identified potential weaknesses. Then came the conditioning phase, where rewards and punishments were carefully calibrated to shape behavior. Women who adapted quickly were given small privileges. Those who resisted faced escalating punishments that stopped just short of execution. The final stage involved integration into the harem hierarchy, where broken women were expected to participate in breaking others. Senior concubines were required to train newcomers, forcing them to become complicit in the same system that had destroyed their own identities. This created a cycle of trauma where victims became perpetrators, ensuring the system's continuation across generations. The psychological manipulation extended to the sultans themselves, who were raised from birth to view women as disposable objects rather than human beings. Palace education for young princes included lessons in dominance and control that normalized violence against women. They were taught that mercy was weakness, that hesitation was failure, and that absolute power required absolute ruthlessness. The architectural design of the harem reinforced this psychological control through spatial manipulation that would impress modern prison designers. Narrow corridors prevented large gatherings, latticed windows allowed surveillance while preventing communication with the outside world. Multiple levels of locked doors created a maze where escape was impossible and rescue unlikely. The economic aspects of this system reveal its calculated efficiency. Each executed woman represented a significant financial loss in terms of purchase price, training costs, and maintenance expenses. Yet the sultans continued these executions because the psychological benefits of terror outweighed the economic costs. Dead women served as permanent warnings to the living, making the investment in fear worthwhile. The international diplomatic consequences of these mass murders were carefully managed through Ottoman foreign policy. European ambassadors, who witnessed harem executions, were quietly warned against reporting what they had seen. Those who ignored these warnings faced diplomatic retaliation, trade restrictions, or expulsion from Ottoman territories. The empire's economic and military power made challenging these practices diplomatically dangerous for smaller European states. The religious justifications for these executions were crafted by palace scholars who twisted Islamic law to support practices that violated basic human dignity. These interpretations were never accepted by mainstream Islamic authorities, but the sultan's control over religious institutions within their territories made opposition dangerous. Scholars who questioned these interpretations faced exile, imprisonment, or execution themselves. The medical aspects of these systematic murders reveal another layer of calculated cruelty. Palace physicians were required to examine executed women to confirm death, but they were also expected to study the effects of different execution methods. This created a grotesque form of medical research where human suffering became data for improving future killings. The destruction of evidence was as systematic as the murders themselves. Palace records of executions were regularly purged, bodies were disposed of in ways that prevented identification, and witnesses were eliminated or silenced through various means. This systematic erasure explains why many of these atrocities remained hidden from historical scrutiny for centuries. The legacy of this systematic violence extended far beyond the palace walls. Families throughout the Ottoman Empire lived in terror that their daughters might be selected for the harem, knowing that such selection was often a death sentence disguised as an honor. This fear shaped marriage practices, family structures, and social relationships across the empire for centuries. The psychological techniques developed in Ottoman harems influenced interrogation and control methods that appeared in various forms throughout history. The combination of isolation, identity destruction, and systematic terror became a template for breaking human resistance that totalitarian regimes would later study and adapt. The women who died in these palace chambers were not statistics or footnotes in imperial history. They were daughters, sisters, mothers whose lives were cut short by a system that valued absolute power over human dignity. Their screams echoed through marble corridors before being silenced forever, but their stories demand remembrance. The Ottoman Sultans created a machinery of death that operated with bureaucratic efficiency and psychological sophistication. They turned intimacy into imprisonment, marriage into murder, and power into the systematic destruction of human souls. The evidence of their crimes survives in archives, in archaeological remains, and in the traumatized collective memory of cultures that suffered under their rule. Understanding this history isn't about condemning entire civilizations or religions. It's about recognizing how absolute power corrupts absolutely, how systematic dehumanization can become normalized, and how the capacity for evil exists within human institutions when unchecked by accountability, justice, or basic human compassion. The water of the Bosphorus carried away thousands of bodies, but it couldn't wash away the truth. These women existed, they suffered, they died, and their stories serve as eternal warnings about what happens when power faces no limits and human life has no value.